I have to think that China would probably prefer that pandemonium, that disarray, continue both domestically and internationally, because ultimately it's much better from China. China is capitalizing on all of these different areas on a very opportunistic basis. We drop out of trade agreements, they come in. We get out of the WHO, they raise their presence in the WHO. On and on and on. We're dropping the ball in terms of foreign aid, they end their foreign aid. We're basically leaving Africa in the dust. They're happy to embrace Africa. It's working very well for them, I should add. So I'm not convinced at all that they want Trump gone.
That's Daniel Wagner, returning to the All Things Risk podcast to talk the Chinese Vortex. Welcome back to the All Things Risk podcast. I'm Ben Catania. I am your host, and around here we explore ourselves and the world at large through the lenses of risk and uncertainty. And today we welcome back Daniel Wagner to the show. Daniel has been a guest several times. He's a friend of the podcast, and we've recently been doing a series on COVID-19. This time, however, we talk China, and specifically the focus of Daniel's latest book, the third in a three-part series on China. This one is called The Chinese Vortex, the Belt and Road Initiative and its Impact on the World. And as you'll hear, the Belt and Road Initiative is a set of large infrastructure initiatives that China's been using to extend its influence on the world. And it is a reflection of China's vast and growing power and influence on the world. But as you will also hear, all is not as it seems with the initiative. It hasn't been as successful as originally intended, and it is a very insightful prism through which to view and understand not only China's place in the world, how it views the world, but also its weaknesses. And we cover a lot in this conversation, including the origins of the Belt and Road Initiative, so-called debt trap diplomacy, how projects have been received, China's export of authoritarianism, China and COVID-19, how China views the upcoming US elections, and a lot more. So let's get into it. Let's get sucked in to the Chinese Vortex. Here is Daniel Wagner. Daniel, welcome back to the All Things Risk podcast. Yet another appearance and yet another book for
Ben,
you.
this is becoming quite a habit, but I think it's a good habit.
It's great. And you've got another book that we're going to be talking about, The Chinese Vortex, the Belt and Road Initiative and its Impact on the World. And your productivity on books and being able to produce these wonderful volumes of work on international relations in China, it continues to impress me. So congratulations on, I guess what you're saying is the third of this trilogy on China.
Well, thanks for saying that, Ben. It is the third and the final. I think I need to set my sights on something else going forward. But a big part of the reason why I'm able to be so productive and prolific with writing books is because, first of all, I'm a fast writer. But if it wasn't for self-publishing platforms like Amazon's Kindle Direct Publishing, which I use now, this is my fifth book using it, this just wouldn't be possible. But I'm never going back to conventional publishing, I can tell you that.
Well, let's get into this latest one. When I first heard of the Belt and Road Initiative, it was described as one belt, one road, and I kept calling it that. But for my listeners who are new to it or don't know that much about the Belt and Road Initiative, maybe we just start from there. What is it? And what are the objectives of the initiative?
Sure. So the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, started in 2013. It is a $1 trillion initiative to produce infrastructure projects and promote development all over the world. There are something like 75 to 80 formal members of the BRI. There are another 50 or so that have signed MOUs, but maybe haven't launched projects specifically and may not end up doing so. But this is such an ambitious undertaking. There really is only one country in the world that could do this, and that, of course, is China. Who else would imagine at one time commencing scores of infrastructure projects all over the world? And I'm talking about every continent. It's just mind-blowing in terms of its grandiosity. And I first of all should probably say that China started out with good intentions, or at least it said that it did. But very often things get lost in translation once you get down in the weeds. And when this project was formally launched, it was in Kazakhstan in 2013. And President Xi was speaking about a peaceful rise and about non-interference in other countries' business and promoting development. Well, there certainly has been a promotion of development. And it certainly has been peaceful. I mean, China's not waging war while it's doing all of this stuff. But it hasn't quite worked out as many people anticipated, and maybe even as Xi anticipated, in terms of not interference in other people's affairs. One of the biggest aspects of this that has drawn so much criticism is what's called debt trap diplomacy, wherein these countries which cannot afford to incur tens of billions of dollars of debt are incurring tens of billions of dollars of debt with no way really to pay it back. And China knew this, and they didn't give them the money. They lent them the money, sometimes at high interest rates. So in terms of its own altruism, that wasn't really apparent here. China isn't giving away all this money. They expect to be paid back. And if they're not paid back, they've drafted the contracts in such a way that they really have the ability to de facto expropriate these assets. And some of these assets are strategic national assets, like ports and railroads and that sort of thing in these countries, power plants. And because of the way these contracts were drafted, the governments don't have the right to basically say no. Normally, the way expropriation works, as you know, is that if there's a problem, it's the government that expropriates the foreign investor's assets. It's not the other way around. But in this case, it's the foreign investor, the Chinese government, that expropriates the asset in the host country. So it's totally backward. We'll get into discussion, I'm sure, of some of the backlash that's resulted because of this and other things associated with the BRI. But that gives you a sense of what it's about.
So in terms of the objectives of the initiative, and first of all, it's a collection of projects, isn't it?
It is.
Ports
Dozens
and railways.
of these projects all over the world, right.
And is the BRI an umbrella term or an umbrella framework for this collection of projects and initiatives?
That's exactly what it is.
Okay. So if we think about what you just described, debt trap diplomacy, then could we say that one of the objectives of this of the BRI is to create client states or vassal states across the initiative?
It certainly is. In fact, sure. In fact, another way to characterize it, Ben, is to say that this is all about the projection of China's soft power. And in some cases, it's hard power because in the case of Djibouti, it's built a military installation in Djibouti, which competes directly with the U.S. military installation also located there. And some of the ports that it's built, for example, could have dual use. So one of the countries that's really concerned about all of this is India. It describes what Beijing is doing as creating a string of pearls, which is surrounding India from a maritime perspective. Well, let's bear in mind, the BRI is both concerning land routes from China to Europe and sea routes which complement it, which go all around the world. The basic objective is mostly, apart from the projection of soft power, to acquire natural resources. And if it wasn't for the fact that so many of these countries have natural resources, I'm not sure China would have sought them out to be included in the BRI. But at the end of the day, yes, it's about development. Yes, it's about infrastructure projects, but it's also about meeting China's short and long-term needs. Mm-hmm. And they've never really been shy about doing that. That's not a crime. Lots of countries around the world do something similar. But in the process, China has been really accused of practicing neo-colonialism in terms of how it's going about doing this.
Mm-hmm. So one of the, I suppose, the attractive aspects, if you are a recipient of one of these projects, if you're a government, a host government, if you compare the requirements of a loan or an infrastructure project that's partly funded by the World Bank or another one of the regional development banks, there are so many of these conditions around governance, environmental performance, fiscal responsibility, social performance, and in China's case, you don't have any of that in the terms of the BRI. So I suppose if you were and maybe we can get into this, why the Chinese government has sort of targeted, or you mentioned Djibouti, but other states that are not very high on things like the Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index, things like this, why all of these governments have been targeted by the BRI, and I suppose there's an obvious attraction there.
A couple of things to say about that. One is that Beijing created a memorandum of understanding with the 7 major multilateral development banks, the MDBs, to cooperate on the BRI, but it never implemented them. And a big part of the reason why it didn't is that it doesn't want to have to jump through all the governance hoops that would inevitably be part of a collaboration with the MDBs. So it's really, really curious that they've got this MOU, but they never used it. Mm-hmm. Another reason, which is consistent with this, is that if you look at, I think it's something like 35-40% of the countries that are in the BRI, they're among the worst ranked countries for corruption and transparency in Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index. And that's not really a concern for China because it does things its own way. And of course, that inevitably involves some corruption and greasing of wheels and that sort of thing. So that meshes very nicely. But then, of course, these countries also happen to be among the poorest of the poor and then need the assistance that Beijing is offering. And in fairness to Beijing, there's only so many resources that are available among the global lending community for infrastructure projects in the developing world. This is a huge problem which has been addressed by the MDBs on an ongoing basis about why there is so little institutional investment, for example, going on in infrastructure in the developing world. And I spent a good chunk of last year living in Cote d'Ivoire, working for the African Development Bank, in fact, exploring that very topic. That all said, I don't know that there's necessarily going to be any change in Beijing's modus operandi on that subject, because I think it would simply conflict too much with the way they prefer to do business in the BRI and the foundation that's already been established.
Right. At the same time, and maybe we can talk a little bit about how some of these projects have performed or have been received, because you offer a number of examples in the book, Angola, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and the case of this dam in Ecuador where things didn't really go according to plan. So how successful have these initiatives been in a number of these countries?
Yeah, some have been successful, meaning the investment functions properly and there haven't necessarily been a lot of problems. Mm-hmm. But some have been spectacular failures. And let's just talk for a moment about the Coca-Codo Dam in Ecuador. This is a $1.7 billion project that was funded 85% through China Export-Import Bank, involved strictly Chinese engineers, strictly Chinese construction companies, etc. They didn't even do a proper environmental impact assessment on this thing. They just wanted to rush it through. And by the time it was done in 2016, what ended up happening was over the course of 2 years, they discovered something like 7,000 cracks in the dam. It never ran at full capacity. It has failed to deliver electricity on a meaningful or sustained basis. And poor Ecuador now is saddled with this massive debt, which it had to refinance, and it actually took out more debt to try to refinance the existing debt. And now they're in a debt trap. China's getting paid back with highly discounted oil from Ecuador. So they got what they needed. Ecuador is now stuck with this bum investment and all this debt. And it's just one of the best examples that I can think of how things have gone very, very wrong.
Right. And another example that you mentioned in the book and was in the headlines recently, it was that of Malaysia and 1MDB, the development fund in Malaysia, and a change in government and a trial and a whole range of things they're trying to unpick in Malaysia as a result of China's involvement.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's still, as you say, ongoing. So the very brief overview is that the former Prime Minister Razak was in bed with China and took on all this debt for some, again, strategic assets that were overpriced. They were just bloated, and in the process helped finance his re-election campaign. One thing led to another. He was ousted for corruption on a massive scale. Mahathir Mohamad got in, this elder statesman who was previously prime minister for a couple of decades or something. And he tried to clean this thing up. He went to Beijing. He said, we're not going to do this way. These projects will not stand. He renegotiated them. I think they took something like a third off of the price of this $120 billion project. And the saga just continues. I mean, the trial of Razak just literally this past week ended, and looks like he's going to jail for quite some time. Of course, you never know until it's done. It's not done. But this is just another example. That was not a desperately poor country. That was a middle-income country that was strategically important because of its location, and they came to an understanding, and they were playing the same set of tainted rules. And it just sort of feeds corruption on so many levels, whether it's a desperately poor country or a corrupt politician.
Mm-hmm. Another example that we've talked about before, actually, is of Angola. And Angola has pushed back and has said, no, we want these schools, these roads. We don't want this plan that you've got for the BRI. This is what we need. And more governments should probably do that type of thing.
Yeah, that's exactly right. In the process, many governments have gotten a lot smarter. They made some initial mistakes by agreeing to these onerous terms. But Angola is an example of one that came back and said, hey, actually, we're not going to just do whatever you want to do on your laundry list. We've got a laundry list of our own. And they started saying things like, we want schools built here, we want roads built there. And they weren't just signing on the dotted line anymore. And the good part about all of this, one of the good parts, I suppose, is that African governments in particular are becoming smarter consumers from China. So some of the damage is done and it cannot be undone, but this is an ongoing process. And in the process, China's really pretty badly damaged its own reputation by taking this bulldozer approach to the BRI rather than a fair negotiation where the terms were agreed by all instead of simply imposed by one. I learned, as you probably learned a long time ago in the cross-border risk management business, those deals that are fair for all the parties tend to have the fewest problems. And so China was really sowing the seeds of its own problems by doing what it was doing the way it was doing and to the extent that it was doing it.
As far as I'm aware, its reputation in a country like Zambia is pretty much in the gutter.
Well, that's right. And Zambia is another perfect example in the sense that it had graduated from highly indebted poor country status back in the 1990s when so much of the debt was written off by the MDBs. And here, 2 decades later, it's resumed its HIPC status. And that didn't need to happen. And of course, Zambia is in no better position to pay off those kinds of debt now than they were 20 years ago.
Right.
So it's anybody's guess how this is going to happen. But in the process, you would imagine that a lot of this debt would have been renegotiated, refinanced, and that China would be forgiving a lot of this debt. Well, it actually is not. It is forgiving limited amounts of the debt in usually small and not very meaningful amounts. There are very few examples that I found where you would have, say, $100 million of debt that's simply written off. That's not going to happen, even though China did last year make a commitment to the G20 that it was going to do just that, where some of this debt was concerned. So it's a very complicated web, Ben. There's a lot of factors at play.
Mm-hmm. Do we have a sense of how many of these projects have been, quote unquote, successful from either the Chinese or the host government side?
I didn't specifically look at that. I mean, there are so many failures or disappointments that was really the focus of most of what I looked at. But I did say at the outset, I wanted to be fair in saying that, the objective overall is building infrastructure and promoting development. And certainly a fair amount of that has happened. Lots of jobs have been created, a fair amount of tax revenue, that sort of thing. It really boils down to, if you want to have a long-term relationship with another country, are you going to go for a short-term profit and a quick buck and try to get the best deal for yourself, or are you going to do something that's equitable for all parties concerned? I think that's a lesson that Beijing has learned in the process.
Do you think they've learned it? I hope they do. But when I think about some of the things that we talked about earlier on about covenants around governance in some of these deals, social, environmental factors, a lot of those are risk management tools. And I think you and I both know that if you're doing a big project in a country, in an emerging market economy, or any other economy for that matter, an international project, there are a whole host of risk factors that can emerge. And a lot of where, say, the World Bank has been born out of the school of hard knocks on a number of projects that didn't go well. And as a result, you've got certain practices that hopefully help reduce those risks and help make those projects successful. So on the one hand, I would like to think that China is going through that learning curve and is turning around and saying, okay, how could we improve on this? But on the other hand, I don't know. I perhaps that's the case, but perhaps if the approach is a heavy-handed one, maybe that doesn't factor in. It's an interesting dilemma, and I really don't know. I mean, do Chinese companies involved in the BRI think about risk management?
Yeah, there's a couple of questions there. Let me just start out by saying that in 2018, 5 years after the BRI started, Beijing realized that not all was going swimmingly. Mm-hmm. And they made a commitment back then to pivot. And the pivot involved being a greener BRI, because many of the projects are dirty. Many coal projects, for example, they've just been exporting coal projects to all sorts of countries that either didn't have them or not on scale. And now they've got a big pollution problem on top of everything else. And they also realized that there's this backlash going on. And so they wanted to basically do a 2.0 BRI light and a friendlier BRI. And everybody recognizes that would take some time. But I don't think too many people think that there's been sufficient commitment or evidence that all of this stuff is actually going to stick and be meaningful at the end of the day. So only time is going to tell on that front. But Beijing knows there's a problem, and they know now that it's in their interest to start doing things a better way. In terms of risk management, well, I don't think a lot of Chinese companies think too much about risk management when they're doing some of this stuff. The way it works, and you saw it in the book, is that there used to be a belief among many people in the West that Beijing snaps its fingers and all the provinces snap to attention in China and do whatever Beijing wants. That might have been the case many years ago. It's no longer the case. And what ended up happening here is it was sort of a free-for-all with a lot of Chinese state-owned enterprises, state-owned banks, China Exim, China Development Bank, who did the bulk of the lending, a free-for-all to basically say who can grab the most of the BRI pie, who can lend the most, who can grab the most. And they didn't necessarily do a lot of due diligence. Some of the bigger lending institutions did, but a lot of the construction companies, for example, they didn't know the first thing about the countries where they were going to. They just knew that they needed to build a dam or a port or whatever it was, and they went and did it. And I don't have the sense that there was much coordination at all. Again, it reminded me in doing the research more of the Wild West than anything else. And that's a big part of the reason why Beijing has the problem that it has, because although you would like to think in a centrally planned economy, everything is very meticulous and studiously done and deliberate. It isn't in this case. And I think it speaks to some of the frailties and the pitfalls of the communist system and the Chinese Communist Party in this case.
Yeah, I'd like to talk a little bit about that because I found that part of the book to be very interesting. And then you have a section that describes dysfunction on a grand scale. And you talk about state-owned enterprises and provincial, local governments getting involved in some of these projects. And really I'm not a China scholar, but it sounds like it's a system of kickbacks and possibly some nepotism and corruption there around who gets involved in some of these projects. And it doesn't. And the other thing that you emphasize at one point in the book is that a lot of the BRI was born out of weakness in China's growth, in the global economy, dwindling reserves. So that neither of those two things strike me as being recipes for success. And also, I think, given where we are globally, it does reveal that there are some undercurrents. There is a soft underbelly to this China story, this Chinese behemoth that is rising. Yeah,
certainly so. And I'm glad you brought that up. I wanted to be sure and say something about it. And that is that in 2013, 2012, the Chinese economy was already on a downward trajectory. And a lot of the industries, a lot of the big companies were in trouble. So part of the reason why the BRI was born is to basically rescue the Chinese economy and these various Chinese firms. Because there wasn't sufficient demand for what it is they were doing in China. The formula they were using in many cases didn't work all that well. It might have at one time, but it wasn't any longer. There were just bleeding cash. And the Chinese government basically had to find a way to keep the plates spinning. And you'll be aware that keeping the plates spinning is a central tenet of the CCP's game plan, meaning they have to maintain stability, they have to give the appearance of constantly being moving forward economically and giving people a better life than they had in their parents' era, et cetera, et cetera. And the only way they can do that is to keep being perceived as moving forward and having these fantastic growth rates, et cetera, et cetera. So the BRI is as much, if you will, about the CCP's frailties and failings as it is about maintaining the economic juggernaut in a forward motion. And it did do that. So that's one of the things. I mean, you're going to spend $1 trillion on infrastructure. It's pretty clear it's going to have its desired effect at the domestic level by giving a lot of these companies money and keeping them flush with cash, et cetera. So, yeah, that's a lesser talked about component of the BRI and why it was born.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned keeping the plate spinning, which I think is a very apt analogy. How long can China keep those plates spinning, do you think?
So this is one of those discussions that economists and political scientists like to talk about. People talk about this inevitable crash landing of the Chinese economy, hard landing, soft landing. My experience has been that there's generally no landing at all. And the reason being that under this type of a government, you have the ability to manipulates your statistics and divert resources any way you want. And at the end of the day, you could argue that what would have crushed some economies before, massive cities that have been built without people living in the buildings, or, just extending oneself well beyond the way one should or ordinarily could survive. It doesn't seem to matter there because they just shift resources around. They, change their reporting. They do whatever they need to maintain the appearance that everything is just fine. And to their credit, it's worked. It's worked. If you tried to do that in so many other countries, I think it would have been so obvious and so apparent, and it would have failed spectacularly much of the time. So I'm not of the opinion, like some people like to believe, that the CCP is about to implode, even with the COVID component of the equation. I think with the sledgehammer that they're using among their own people and the vice that they've got their people in, I don't think there's much of a chance at all that there's going to be a backlash or a revolution or the things that you might think would ordinarily happen in a different type of economy.
And I suppose one of the things that plays into that is the Chinese government's ability to utilize technology, which, as you have pointed out in your other books, is well ahead of many Western countries and possibly allows us to make those predictions of a hard landing that may not be based at all in what's actually going on.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that use of technology through AI, blockchain, what have you, that's not going to disappear. One of the things that I talk about in the book is the creation of the first national digital currency, which is, of course, being done by China. The very unsexily named Digital Currency Electronic Payment, the DCEP. I mean, you would have thought they could have come up with something a little bit more imaginative than that. Yeah. But to their credit, they're ultimately probably this year going to be launching what is the world's first national digital currency. And apart from helping to internationalize the Chinese economy further, and maybe even encourage people to use the yuan in more conventional settings just because they become more familiar with utilizing Chinese currency, one type or another, one of the objectives here clearly is to use the DCEP to extend China's influence in the economies of the BRI. The expectation is that they're going to use the DCEP to make all of the future transactions between the countries of the BRI and China denominated in the DCEP. And of course, in the process, although it's using blockchain, the Chinese have found a way to access the information associated with all of these transactions, even overseas in the future, and then mine the information that they're mining on the rest of us through cyber attacks and other means. So it's not just they want to be on the cutting edge and be the first to do this national digital currency. It's that it fits very nicely with the social credit system and the manner in which the Chinese government keeps tabs on its people and other people around the world. This is certainly part of that mosaic.
Right. And for those of you who are new to the social credit system, it's basically like that episode of Black Mirror, isn't it? Where you do stuff, you get points, and you can do more things, and if you are naughty, you can't travel, or you can't do certain things, buy properties, invest in certain things, etc.
That's right, and it's worth adding. It's worth adding, Ben, if I may, that the social credit system is being exported. The technology for it has been exported to a number of countries around the world.
Let's talk about that, because that is alarming, and I guess that's another dimension that we haven't yet explored. I mean, on the one hand, you could say that some of these projects that they've gone wrong because you have corrupt governments, and if the host government is sort of corrupt, then it becomes about getting into this debt trap diplomacy. But if you have a host government that may be corrupt but also authoritarian and wants to control its population, even if that country may be a democracy. I'm thinking about a place like the Philippines, where China has significantly penetrated in the last 4 years. What does that mean? What does that mean for liberal democratic values, the post-war world, if you like, for democracy, for all of these things that the West has been promoting and that have taken root in some places in a very mixed way after the Cold War? What does that all mean for that, and where we're going in terms of where the world is going in terms of our forms of governance, our future forms of governance? So there's a lot there.
Answer, of course,
that's a lot there, obviously.
Yeah, indeed. The short answer is nothing good. Everyone knows, has this wave of authority sweeping the world, the strong person rule, and the gradual erosion of democratic principles, etc. I mean, the Philippines, again, is a great example of that. You could say, of course, the U.S. is a great example of that as well. You know which side of the political coin I happen to be on that. That all said, this is totally consistent with that general erosion. And China hasn't been hesitant to export this technology to some of the worst authoritarian governments in the world. They're only too happy to give these leaders the ability to do the same thing in terms of surveillance of their own people. And China, of course, is then establishing its bona fides with some of these worst of the worst characters in the process. I think, unfortunately, it's pointing to a world in the future where, as technology becomes more omnipotent, we unfortunately have to anticipate that our rights, our freedoms, are going to continue to be gradually eroded. I don't see how the opposite can possibly be true and still be consistent with the rollout of this type of technology.
That's alarming. And at the same time, and I think about the West, and you just don't have to scroll very far on, say, your Facebook feed or wherever. There's a huge amount of cynicism around everything, really. We're incredibly divided, and I do want to get into what the US and allies can be doing in the face of that, but it seems like I'm talking about we, I mean Western Europe and OECD countries and largely liberal democratic countries, we're weakening, and it doesn't feel to me like we are in a good place around projecting values around democracy, equality, etc. We're very divided, and there are a number of headwinds, and that just plays into China's favor and Russia's favor as well, I presume.
I mean, maybe Beijing should be given credit for being prescient in that regard, or maybe it is that they're helping to create their own reality, and then this alternative reality for a global order in other parts of the world, as I talked about in my book, China Vision. I mean, I really wish I could say I'm optimistic, Ben, but I'm not. I think the more that I learn, the less optimistic I become in that regard.
Yeah, I waver. I go back and forth. I think when I talk to you, I tend to be more pessimistic, and but when I look at a few other things, I get a little bit more optimistic. And I'm thinking about my conversation with John Perkins, who wrote Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and there's a lot of similarity to actually both of your messages. In fact, even though I think you have more of a darker bent on where it's all going, and I think he has a view that there are, we're getting, books like yours, for example, gets us wiser to the facts of what's happening around us, and allows people to, whether it's question their own politicians or to do things on their own, to try to combat some of where things are going. And I'll just leave it at that, but it's an interesting contrast in messages, but with some very, very similar currents.
Well, let's see as time goes on whether we're closer to midnight or closer to sunrise.
Yeah. I did want to bring in a couple of other things. One was, and you do talk a little bit about this in your book, but COVID-19 and what that means for China's foreign policy and the BRI. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great example of Beijing's ability to spin the worst into the best. I did an interview earlier this week with RT's Crosstalk, and the gentleman who was my opponent in this discussion was Deng Xiaoping's interpreter, so he comes from the old school. And he just spent all this time talking about how wonderful everything is and how wonderful China is and how wonderful its management of the COVID thing is. And, you know, you might be inclined to just burst out laughing, which I didn't do. I was respectful of him, of course, and he was respectful of me. But they're coming from a different frame of reference, Ben. They just see the world in a different way. And while the rest of the world is saying what a colossal mess they made of the whole COVID thing, they're thinking they did a spectacular job. They may have done a great job of managing it once they started to properly manage it, and they did it like no other government really can. When they clamp down, they really clamp down, and everybody stays in their home, and you can't leave until you get a temperature check, and one member of the family goes out food shopping once a week. I mean, this type of thing. But the rest of the world doesn't see that. They see the mess that we're all living in now. And they see incompetence, they see hubris, they see a lack of transparency. And I guess this dissonance is really at the core of the whole problem, not only with COVID, but with the BRI and overall between China and the rest of the world. China just views things. The Chinese government views things differently than a lot of other governments do. They see absolutely nothing wrong with their orientation to the world, their interpretation of events. And from their perspective, they're saying, why doesn't everybody else snap into line and see the world our way? They genuinely believe the Kool-Aid they're drinking, but not much of the rest of the world does.
I suppose they think of it the same way as, or they would look at American ideals and say, well, this has been a colossal failure given U.S. intervention in a variety of states. And you talk about human rights and this and that and the other thing. Look what's going on domestically, et cetera, et cetera. So all bets are off. And there's something to be, not to be said for that, but there's, I think, a sense of trying to understand that viewpoint is very important in order to be able to think about and respond to that. And I guess I would add that I think that your president doesn't help, even certainly on the COVID-19 response doesn't help, because nothing matters. You know, there are no facts. There's nothing to kind of counteract it when your head of state says hydroxychloroquine or whatever, and the response is much worse than what he proclaims it to be. And again, the divisiveness, all of a sudden, I mean, I'm looking at this from the point of view of someone in London, and you see the headlines of Fauci and masks and this big quote unquote debate about COVID-19. Well, the world's superpower is not really standing up to China on this very, very well. There's a lot of hypocrisy, even though Trump talks tough to China, which is something that Obama hasn't, the Obama administration didn't do as much of. I don't think it helps. And so there's something to be said for China's view, given what's happening.
Well, it would be hard to disagree with any of that. And in fact, I don't disagree with any of that. I think it's been a colossal failure on America's part, and all you have to do is look at the numbers in terms of infections and deaths to know that we are the global epicenter of this thing. We have been for months. We probably will be for months to come. And there's a very good reason for that. It's a lack of leadership. It's the politicization of the issue. It's a whole bunch of things turned into it. It's just also its own version of a colossal mess. And of course, you know, here in the States, I'm living it like 330 million of my countrymen. I'm preparing for an overseas trip, and my family has been asking me, well, what is COVID like in these countries? And I said, dude, I mean, all of them are far better off than we are. I mean, the question is, will they accept me as an American in their country? It's not the other way around. So I don't know. I don't mean to belittle the issue at all, but I think the whole thing is so absurd and, just such an abject failure that I don't know what one can do except to raise one's hand and say, I give up. I mean, with this guy in the White House, all hope is lost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So would China prefer a Biden presidency or Trump getting reelected, do you think?
So there are a lot of pundits who are suggesting what they think is the obvious, that of course they would prefer Biden because Trump has been so bad for bilateral relations and a host of other reasons. I actually take a contrary view on that. I think that the Chinese actually secretly prefer that Trump stay in power for a couple of reasons. One is that he is then presiding over the ongoing disarray, some would argue the gradual dissolution of America as we've known it. But secondarily, look at the destruction that has been caused all around the world with the dissolution of bilateral relationships between America and some of its greatest allies. I have to think that China would probably prefer that pandemonium, that disarray, continue both domestically and internationally, because ultimately it's much better from China. China is capitalizing on all of these different areas on a very opportunistic basis. We drop out of trade agreements, they come in. We get out of the WHO, they raise their presence in the WHO. On and on and on. We're dropping the ball in terms of foreign aid, they end their foreign aid. We're basically leaving Africa in the dust, they're happy to embrace Africa. It's working very well for them, I should add. So I'm not convinced at all that they want Trump gone.
And that would be a very art of war-esque way of looking at it. And it's probably quite accurate, get to where you need to be without fighting.
Right. Let's not forget, the Chinese are playing by the Unrestricted Warfare Playbook, which is this book that was written in 1999 by two Chinese colonels. And it basically says we should fight everywhere we can, any way we can. That includes, flooding countries with illicit drugs and, participating in undermining democracies and a whole host of other things. The gloves are off. Everybody understands that the world basically is being forced to choose between an American and a Chinese frame of reference. And so far, people understand that ultimately the world is better, and they're probably better off if America remains strong and overall at the helm of many things. There's about 20% of a Pew Center survey in 2018 of 26,000 people in 25 countries who basically said we would prefer China. But 63% of these people said we actually prefer the U.S. So as long as that's skewed very much in the U.S. favor, and I think that if Trump is relieved of his duty, hopefully, in January, that stands a very good chance of remaining in America's favor. But if not, it's hard to say. I mean, China is really, really good at capitalizing on these opportunities, and so many that are being presented by America.
So what would a Biden presidency mean, do you think, for U.S.-China relations?
I'm not convinced that there would be any kind of wholesale change. There is wide bipartisan support for much of what Trump has done with China. Most people here realize that it was an unbalanced relationship and that something needed to change. Trump, I think, will ultimately, in terms of the history books, get the credit for having done so. But I don't see the pendulum swinging and going back toward where we were anytime soon.
Right.
Maybe never.
Yeah. That is interesting, and well, it may be inevitable. I was going to say worrying, but maybe the right word is inevitable.
Well, I mean, I think a rebalancing can be a healthy thing in so many arenas. And what's happening is also forcing America to take a hard look at itself and the way it's doing things and the way it's being perceived. It didn't used to have to care. I'm fond of saying now that America didn't used to have a proper peer since the Second World War. Now it does. China is either equivalent or better at or coming up close to where America is in a whole host of areas. And the smartest thing that America could do would be to double down and devote its resources to the tasks at hand and use its tremendous resources to turn this ship around. And we can do that. But I think we need someone else at the helm to do that. And I'm not sure that Biden will also necessarily be the person to do that. Maybe he simply reverses America's slide, and maybe whoever succeeds him is the one who actually really starts to turn things around. We'll see.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see how we live in interesting times, my friend. We certainly do. What do you think other states Western states, I'm thinking about the EU, Western Europe, other Western countries, what can and could they be doing to counterbalance some of China's forays?
I think in the case of some of Europe's strongest and largest countries, the Germanys and Frances and UKs of the world, they need to look in the mirror themselves and basically say, yeah, we've got these really important, significant business relationships with China, but we're paying a tremendous price for maintaining them. And America has basically said, we're willing to sacrifice those lucrative arrangements so that we can get this thing balanced to where it probably should have been from the beginning. If European nations aren't going to do the same thing, and I know that their economies are highly dependent on China also, then we're going to have an issue. I think the smartest thing that the U.S. and its allies can do is come up with a unified approach to counterbalancing China. We don't have the ability to do that in the Trump era. But if we got back to where America has traditionally been in terms of strong alliances and speaking with a common voice, and taking actions that collectively could have a real impact on Beijing, that I think is the ticket. And we have the ability to do that. What Beijing fears most is that the U.S. and its allies will be unified and speak with that common voice.
Well, I think that's probably a good place to wrap things up, and because that's a little bit of a message of hope. At least I like to take.
Coming from me, that's not a bad thing, right?
Absolutely, sure. But was there anything that we didn't get to cover that you wanted to mention around the BRI or China or anything that's going on at present?
I would simply say that the BRI is such an excellent example of how China is actually putting into practice its vision for this alternative world order. It's doing it as we're watching. And we may not think of it in those terms, but to me, that's really what this is. I think the book is important for that reason, because if this is just the beginning of how China is going to roll this out, the DCEP and other things will follow, we better start paying attention, we better understand what it is, and we better start doing something to counteract it.
Well, I think on that note, why don't we wrap things up? So the book's called The Chinese Vortex, and it's available on Amazon and Kindle, right? Can you get a hard copy as well? I presume you can.
It's Kindle and print, and the audio copy should be available before the end of August.
Perfect. Okay. Daniel, thank you very much. This was wonderful and insightful as usual, and congratulations on the book once again.
Thanks very much, Ben, and it's always a pleasure. So until next time.
Absolutely. Until next time. All right. I hope you all found that insightful. Links are in the show notes as usual, including how to get a copy of The Chinese Vortex. And we have a number of great shows lined up. Our next episode will go out in a week's time. So don't forget to subscribe and don't miss anything. And also don't forget to sign up for lots of updates and extras. You can do that via our website, allthingsrisk.co.uk. That's .co.uk. Until next time, and as always, don't forget, risk is life.